Thank you for watching Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Budnam. I am thankful to all news resources and my entire team. Following are the news which have been reported by American, European, Asian, Canadian, African channels and of course Australian, plus news agencies AFP, AP and writers. Now the headlines. How to stay healthy with the good right information. Cocoa getting expensive, so the chocolate. Solar storms which could destroy the whole communication system in the world. Breaking the deadlock in Gaza war has become difficult. Mr. Blinken is in Middle East. Hamas released 2 videos of hostages. Israel is still thinking to invade Rafah in southern Gaza, but United States oppose it. Protest for Gaza in Washington, D.C. Deadly tornadoes hit the central USA. Anti-LGBTQ law in Iraq. Freedom of speech and Gaza protest in university campuses. Now the news headlines. Rather, details.
Hopes are again raised of a possible truce deal in Gaza, with the Hamas delegation meeting mediators in Cairo this Monday. If the talks again fall through, it's feared an Israeli offensive on Rafah will go ahead and lead to more civilian casualties. Outmanned and outgunned by Russia, Ukrainian forces retreat from 3 villages on the eastern front. Kyiv says it can only take the fight back to Moscow once crucial arms supplies arrive from the package pledged by the United States. And Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez will announce in the next few hours whether he'll resign due to what he called a smear campaign against his wife. Thousands of supporters have been taking to the streets to tell the socialist leader not to quit. For those of you just joining us, welcome to the France 24 newsroom in Paris. I'm Alexander Orcott. Now, hopes of a ceasefire in Gaza are growing once more, with the Hamas delegation visiting Cairo this Monday. It's hoped that an agreement will be reached that will secure the release of hostages and prevent an Israeli offensive on Rafah, where around half the population of the enclave is seeking refuge. However, speaking from the World Economic Forum in Riyadh, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, said only the United States could stop Israel from pushing ahead with the mission.
Riyadh's opulence, a world away from the ruins of Gaza. But it was here that Mahmoud Abbas made a desperate plea for outside intervention before Israel carries out an assault on Rafah. Taking to the floor of the World Economic Forum, he called on the US to rein in its closest ally.
We call on the US to ask Israel to refrain from attacking Rafah, because the US is the only country that can stop Israel from carrying out this crime.
Failure to act, Abbas said, would lead to catastrophe.
Only one small strike would force everyone to leave the Gaza Strip, and the biggest catastrophe in the history of the Palestinian people would then happen.
If his calls do fall on deaf ears, the consequences will be felt here in the Gaza Strip. These apocalyptic scenes were filmed in central Gaza. Parts of Rafah are starting to look like this too. For weeks, Israel has threatened to launch an all-out assault on the Gaza Strip's southernmost city. It's become a refuge for hundreds of thousands of internally displaced Palestinians with nowhere else to go. They're now crammed into tents, pressed up against the border with Egypt. Israel's closest Western allies, such as the US, have warned it against launching an assault. But already, Israel has been stepping up its airstrikes on the city, laying the ground for an invasion that could cause huge bloodshed.
In the early hours of this Monday, Israel has already been carrying out airstrikes on Rafah, Hamas reporting 15 people killed when strikes hit 3 homes. Health officials also reported several injuries and deaths caused by twin airstrikes in Gaza City in the north of the enclave. According to the authorities' latest toll, more than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed in almost 7 months of war. A new law passed by the Iraqi parliament imposing heavy prison sentences on the LGBT community has sparked an outcry from human rights groups. The US State Department also issued a statement saying the law threatens the most vulnerable in society. Here's a few of opposing views from Baghdad.
Regarding
the law approved by the House of Representatives, frankly, I am against this law because Iraq is a country of multiple sects and religions. Iraq is a democratic country, so how can a law be passed against democracy and personal freedom?
I support this law against prostitution and homosexuality because it follows the texts of the Quran and the Islamic religion by completely prohibiting this subject due to religious taboos. In addition to this, the government will impose financial penalties and imprisonment for anyone who promotes this act.
Now, Ukraine's army chief says his troops have been forced to make tactical retreats from 3 villages in the east of the country. He warned of a worsening battlefield situation as the Ukrainian forces wait for much-needed arms from a huge US aid package to reach combat zones.
This hotel had recently reopened in 2022, but on Sunday it was just one among several civilian infrastructure destroyed by Russian drone strikes.
At around 4:30, I heard the first explosion. People started coming down to the shelter. Then there was a second and third explosion. I came down here into the courtyard to see what was going on. I heard a drone flying and then was blown away by the shockwave.
While Ukrainian troops struggle amid shortages of weapons and ammunition, Moscow's forces continue to make marginal gains. Kyiv's troops have been forced to retreat from 3 villages in the embattled east, as Russian forces press on with attacks along the front line of more than 1,000 kilometers. President Volodymyr Zelensky says the additional aid package from the US couldn't come soon enough.
We're doing everything possible, contacting all available partners to enhance the protection of the sky by increasing the number and quality of air defense systems at the disposal of our warriors.
Zelensky says the additional aid of $6 billion, along with the provision of Patriot missiles, will help Ukraine protect its skies, a crucial lifeline that could reverse the situation on the battlefield.
Now for a look at the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, where some 20,000 people earlier staged what they called a March for Europe, calling the government to scrap a law that the EU warns will harm its aspirations of joining the bloc. The Foreign Influence Bill was being dubbed the Russian law by its critics due to similar legislation enacted in Moscow that's been used to crack down on dissent. The law would require organizations that accept funds from overseas to register as foreign agents. President Salome Zorabishvili is also opposed to it and has vowed to repeal the bill if it arrives on her desk. Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has described domestic violence as a national crisis after thousands rallied around the country. They were drawing attention to 27 women killed in Australia this year so far in apparent acts of gender-based violence.
I know that we all must do better, but I know this as well, that I've got to be honest. It's not just government's problem, it's a problem of our entire society. And this is a national crisis.
Meanwhile, thousands of supporters of Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez have been taking to the streets, urging him not to resign on Monday. Last week he made the shock announcement that he might stand down following what he called a smear campaign against his wife. An activist group has brought a case against Begoña Gómez to a Madrid court accusing her of corruption.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez took the country by surprise on Wednesday by saying he might step down from the role, a position he has held since 2018. His comments came after a court opened a business corruption probe into his wife. It was in 2014 that the former economics professor turned MP was elected Secretary General of the Spanish Socialist Party. In 2018, Sanchez succeeded in his bid to topple his conservative predecessor, Mariano Rajoy, in a vote of no confidence sparked by anger over corruption in Rajoy's party.
Let me ask you a question, Mr. Rajoy. Are you ready to resign today, right here, right now? Quit, Mr. Rajoy, and all this will be over. You can leave the government in peace.
And Sanchez ultimately took his place. For more than a year, he had to make do without a parliamentary majority, until he began governing in coalition with far-left party Podemos in January 2020. Key to this victory was the backing of Catalonia's largest separatist party, which agreed to abstain from the investiture vote after Sanchez pledged to hold talks on Catalonia's future. One of Europe's longest-serving socialist leaders, Sanchez in 2023 announced a string of measures aimed at helping people cope with the cost of living crisis. They included free public transport for young people and those who are unemployed. His plans to grant amnesty to Catalan separatists in exchange for backing for another term in office triggered protests across Spain.
Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has announced she'll be running for a seat in the European Parliament, a move seen by many as a bid to boost her far-right party. With Meloni heading the list of candidates, Brothers of Italy could exploit its national popularity at an EU level, even if taking a seat in the Parliament would mean she'd have to resign as Prime Minister.
Throwing her hat in the ring for June's EU elections, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni takes the head of the Brothers of Italy list. Announcing her candidacy on Sunday, she vowed to unite Europe's conservatives.
I'm putting myself forward because in addition to being president of Brothers of Italy, I'm also the leader of European conservatives who want to play a decisive role in changing the course of European politics.
Meloni's Brothers of Italy party, which has neo-fascist roots, came top in the nation's 2022 general elections with 26% of the vote. Since her rise to power, the 47-year-old has strived to soften her image by diluting anti-EU rhetoric. But she staunchly rejected values traditionally embraced by the left, including immigration, forging diplomatic partnerships aimed at controlling migrant arrivals in the country. She's also spoken out against LGBTQ rights, her priorities outlined in a raucous speech in 2022.
Yes to a natural family. No to LGBT lobby. Yes to sexual identity. No to gender ideology. Yes to the culture of life.
The June elections are expected to see a major pivot to the far right in many member states, with anti-EU populist parties gaining votes and seats across the EU, a shift that's likely to have significant consequences for EU-level policies.
Now, Oklahoma residents are picking up the pieces after dozens of tornadoes swept paths of destruction across the central U.S. state, causing at least 4 deaths. The city of Sulphur was particularly hard hit, as we can see from these images. Scores of buildings were ripped apart. At least 20 residents were injured. Now, an El Nino-induced drought continues to wreak havoc across southern Africa after the destruction of crops, which is threatening people with famine in Zambia, Malawi and Botswana. The drought is also causing lakes and rivers to dry up. Hippopotamuses, a species high risk of extinction, are caught in the middle.
Dozens of hippos trapped in a pool of mud. Just a few months ago, this river was flowing freely. Today, it's completely dried out, and its wildlife has nowhere to flee to.
We're experiencing a severe drought in our village. This pond had water, but it's completely dried up. Our animals get stuck in this muddy pond every day when they try to drink the water. There's absolutely no water, as you can see. Even the hippos are stuck.
Induced by the El Nino weather pattern, which should last until May, this is one of the region's worst droughts in 4 decades. Since January 2024, extreme climate shocks have killed more than 130 people and destroyed over 2 million hectares of crops across southern Africa.
The river has gone dry. We are currently not getting any clients as we used to. The fishing industry has gone down. Trees are slowly dying. It's not even lush green as we used to experience. Our canoes have run dry and people are actually suffering.
In Botswana, thousands of people have been forced to flee to the north of the country, close to the wetter national parks.
We've moved temporarily because of the drought. We've lost most of our livestock, especially the younger calves. Since we've moved here, the situation has gotten better. Our animals are better. I hope we'll survive the drought.
24 million people in southern Africa are now facing what the UN calls acute hunger, and water scarcity has also aggravated the cholera outbreak in the region, which has killed over 4,000 people since the start of 2023.
That's where we end this edition. Stay tuned for more world news on France 24.
Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome. You're watching Across Africa, and I'm Clarisse Fortuné. Our main stories. The war in Sudan is now in its 2nd year. The UN says it's the world's largest humanitarian crisis with no peace in sight between 2 warring generals. And a decade on in Nigeria, after hundreds of girls were abducted from their school in Chibok, families continue to wrestle with their anguish even as armed groups ramp up their brutal kidnapping strategy. And after that, we'll need to tune in to the sounds of Congolese symphony, the first classical orchestra of its kind in a region that is a combination of European classics and African compositions. It is now one of the most brutal conflicts. Sudan's civil war has entered its 2nd year.
Station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. As efforts intensify to break a deadlock in talks for a deal to free the Israelis still held in Gaza, Hamas released video of 2 hostages, including an Israeli American. It shows Omri Miran, a 47-year-old Israeli, and Keith Siegel, who's 64. It's not clear when the footage was taken. Siegel's wife was released during a brief truce in November. Talks on a hostage release and ceasefire are expected to resume in coming days in Egypt. On ABC's This Week, White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said Israel promises it won't launch an invasion into Rafah until they hear the U.S. point of view.
They've assured us that they won't go into Rafah until we've had a chance to really share our perspectives and our concerns with them, if we're able to get this hostage deal in place, and we are still working at that. Now, Hamas has not fully rejected it. They are considering this proposal on the table. If we can get that in place, then that gives you 6 weeks of peace.
The White House says that in a call today with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Biden reiterated U.S. opposition to a Rafah operation on humanitarian grounds. They also talked about new aid routes into Gaza that are to open this week. There were protests against the war last night at an annual Washington gathering of journalists, newsmakers, and celebrities. Shouts of "Shame on you" greeted those arriving at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. Some protesters lay on the pavement next to vests marked "Press" and splashed with red. President Biden spoke at the dinner but didn't mention the war or the protest in his remarks. Nighttime tornadoes in Oklahoma left at least 4 people dead, one of them a child. In Sulphur, in southern Oklahoma, there was significant damage and destruction to homes and businesses. This evening, heavy rains are the threat, with a flood watch stretching from Louisiana to Missouri. There's international condemnation for a law the Iraqi parliament passed this weekend. It imposes heavy prison sentences on gay and transgender people. The State Department said it threatens those most at risk. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron called it dangerous and worrying. It imposes 10 to 15-year prison sentences for same-sex relations and 1 to 3 years for undergoing or performing gender transition surgery. And 3-time WNBA champion Candace Parker says she's retiring. She's a 2-time league MVP, a 2-time NCAA champion at the University of Tennessee, and a 2-time Olympic gold medalist. She's the only player to win 3 WNBA championships with 3 different teams. Parker played her last game in July and missed the rest of the season with a foot injury. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, why satisfying your chocolate cravings may start taking a bigger bite out of your wallet, and the potential effects in space and on Earth of solar flares.
This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS NewsHour, weeknights on PBS.
Go on social media these days and you're bombarded with ads and influencers touting all sorts of products promising to rid you of digestive tract complaints, supplements, juice cleansers, diets, all promoting what's broadly called gut health. And indeed, cases of inflammatory bowel disease and colon cancer are on the rise. And a 2023 survey for a healthcare company found that 2/3 of those questioned said they have symptoms like gas, bloating, and abdominal pain on a regular basis. But how do we separate the facts from the fads? Dr. Shazia Sadiq is an assistant professor of gastroenterology at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. She's also on the Clinical Guidelines Committee of the American Gastroenterological Association. Dr. Sadiq, why all this attention? Why all this focus on gut health?
Well, we're definitely seeing a rise in gastrointestinal diseases globally over the past 2 decades, from 250 million cases back in 1990 to now more than 440 million cases. And digestive diseases can range from heartburn to hemorrhoids to colon cancer. And especially recently, what we're seeing is an uptick in colorectal cancer, particularly among young individuals, and it's the leading cause of cancer death in men under 50.
Is there any explanation for that rise?
Well, what we're seeing globally is that there are many factors associated with it. One is a Western diet, one that is high in fast food, processed foods, more meat, less diverse vegetables. And then there are other lifestyle factors like alcohol consumption, tobacco use, and also more sedentary behavior.
And how does gut health affect overall health?
Well, it is interesting that emerging research on the gut microbiome, which are the microorganisms that live in your gut, show that there is a link between those microorganisms and your immune function and arguably also your cardiovascular health, metabolic health, and nervous system. So we know what we eat and what we expose our gut to can have impact on our overall health as well.
What are the biggest misconceptions you hear from patients in your practice? And do they ask you about things and products and procedures that, in your view, really don't have any use?
Yes, unfortunately, it's something that's very common. One of the most common things that I'm asked about is about doing colon cleanses, which is this concept that we need to detoxify our body and our gut using laxatives or other cleansing materials. But the reality is that colon cleanses are really not necessary. Our liver and our kidneys detoxify our bodies appropriately, and colon cleanses, if anything, can be harmful in some cases.
Let's talk about what people may be feeling and asking about or wondering about. Are there symptoms that maybe someone can control with over-the-counter medications, and are there symptoms where they should go see a doctor?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're having more severe symptoms like blood in your stool, severe abdominal pain, weight loss that you can't explain, those are all symptoms that you should be seeing a doctor much sooner and likely getting a colonoscopy for colon cancer screening. Other symptoms that are more mild, like bloating, oftentimes those are things that you can do mild changes in your diet. For example, anything that's swallowing air, so carbonated beverages, drinking out of a straw, gum chewing, those are very simple things you can do, cut out of your diet to see if your bloating gets better. But like with any symptom, if it's persistent, you should definitely talk to your doctor.
You talked about patients who are coming in asking about cleanses and things like that. How should people evaluate the claims and these products that are being advertised or influencers are talking about?
Well, I think really what we need is to have any sort of data showing that there is a benefit in gut health and overall health, and really that hasn't borne out at all. If anything, we've seen patients have harms from colon cleanses, like dehydration, electrolyte abnormalities, or even, depending on the type of cleanse, some episodes of colitis, which is inflammation in the colon. So the risks and downsides really don't outweigh the benefits.
Do you see patients who come into you with the side effects, with things that they might not have had if they hadn't done that?
I actually had a patient who came in with rectal pain, and as we started to talk about it, I realized that she had actually done a coffee enema, which was something she had learned from TikTok, and she ended up having imaging findings of colitis as a result of this enema. So unfortunately, people are influenced by what they see on social media, but it's really not data-driven.
So what do you tell your patients how they should maintain their gut health without doing all these other things?
The most important thing is to have a nutritionally diverse diet, so less red meat, lots of vegetables, fiber, fruits, and really avoiding ultra-processed foods. So going for whole foods and fresh foods.
Dr. Shazia Sadiq from the University of Pennsylvania, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
If you've shopped for chocolate lately, you may have noticed that your favorite items are either smaller or more expensive, and sometimes they're both. The key ingredient in chocolate is cocoa, and the price of cocoa is the highest it's ever been. In the last 4 months, it's nearly doubled. Ali Rogan tells us that this worldwide shortage has been years in the making.
It's a sweet treat and can be an affordable indulgence, but the rising cost of cocoa could soon leave a bitter taste in the mouths of chocoholics.
The people who will be affected would be the chocolate lovers who really want to buy good quality chocolate at extremely low prices.
Chocolate making starts with cocoa beans, an extremely vulnerable crop, says supply chain strategist Matt Spooner.
The El Nino last year caused particularly hot, wet weather in Western Africa, which has impacted the quality of the cocoa harvest. In addition, there's a disease which is sweeping through the West African cocoa crops called swollen shoot disease, and this is decimating the cocoa harvest.
West Africa accounts for over 70% of the world's cocoa supply, but low prices and smaller harvests have tightened farmers' margins.
We are investing more, but we have to produce less.
Ghana is one of the hardest hit places, and Ghanaians like Isifu Isaka are struggling to keep family farms afloat.
You are not able to produce the required amount of cocoa bean you are expected, so you produce less. You take this small cocoa bean to the market, you then get more money.
Most of the farms in West Africa are under 10 acres. The farmers who cultivate them earn less than $2 per day.
This crisis has come about because of a long-term underinvestment or underpayment of the farmers.
Another factor, rising production costs. Fertilizers and pesticides are more expensive due to inflation and the war in Ukraine, and they're more necessary as farms age and erratic weather increases the risk of disease. More sustainable practices, like planting cocoa alongside other trees, would make farms more resilient but cost more upfront.
When we talk of sustainability, we shouldn't talk of sustainability in terms of the cocoa tree or the cocoa bean, but sustainability in terms of the living condition of the farmer.
To make matters worse, rampant illegal gold mining threatens the cocoa farms.
Today we don't get labor because instead of going to work for a cocoa farmer, he would rather go and work for an illegal miner who will pay him a huge amount of money as compared to the cocoa sector.
The miners also flood farmland to help extract the gold that lies below the cocoa trees. This is cocoa farmer Janet Giamfi, harvesting one of her 6,000 cocoa trees just last year. This is her land today, ravaged by miners.
My toil, my livelihood was destroyed. I have no source of income anywhere.
Once the gold is extracted, the pits of mercury and heavy metal-laden water pollute the waterways that supply farms miles away.
In the process of their mining, they destroy some of my cocoa trees, and when I complain, it always turns sour. Some of them even threaten me. They've even come to my house at night to make death threats, but thank God, we're still alive.
Cocoa farming isn't just a dangerous business, it's also not very profitable.
People are not interested to becoming cocoa farmers because they don't see the cocoa farming as a good business venture.
That's in part because the high price cocoa is commanding doesn't reach the farmers growing it. In many countries like Ghana, the government sets the so-called farm gate price. It's meant to insulate farmers from low prices, but it's often out of step with the market. In early April, the Ghana Cocoa Board said it would raise the price over 50%. That's still nowhere near the price experts say farmers need to stay afloat.
Somebody sitting at New York Exchange, sitting at the London Exchange, deciding the price for you, the farmer, whom have not even caught catalyst on his hand and reading on the farm before.
Further up the supply chain, big companies like Hershey and Cadbury are increasing prices to make up for high ingredient costs, even as they report shrinking sales. They're also changing recipes.
One strategy is to reformulate the chocolates and increase more non-chocolate ingredients, so maybe more wafers into their chocolates, and reducing the cocoa content so that they can still provide the same size chocolate to a consumer, but actually it contains more non-chocolate ingredients.
The Swiss brand Toblerone had to remove its classic depiction of the Matterhorn mountain peak when it moved some production out of Switzerland to reduce costs. Companies are also diversifying beyond pure chocolate, creating new flavors and marketing other candy. California-based Voyage Foods is taking a different approach altogether, making chocolate without cocoa.
Our core mission is to future-proof some of our favorite foods.
Kelsey Tenney is Voyage's Vice President of Research and Development.
It is not our aim to replace cocoa as a commodity globally. We are looking to essentially buffer out the supply chain and create a product that can be utilized, for example, in your favorite chocolate chip cookie that you buy in the grocery store.
The key ingredient in Voyage's chips and easy melt wafers, grape seeds.
Not everyone has done this, but if you've tasted a raw cacao seed, it tastes nothing like a chocolate bar. And so we study the process and the starting material and aim to recreate a final product through different starting material.
There have been attempts to replicate chocolate through the decades, but for now there's no substitute that can meet global demand. And that's why Isifu says the world still needs cocoa farmers.
If I leave the cocoa sector today, if other people I know also leave the cocoa sector, it means there wouldn't be no cocoa. So how are the consumers going to live without cocoa?
That's a future most chocolate lovers don't want to contemplate. For PBS News Weekend, I'm Ali Rogan.
To most of us, the sun is a steady, never-changing source of heat and light. But to scientists, it's a dynamic star, constantly in flux, sending energy out into space. Right now, experts say it's in its most active period in 2 decades. For us Earthlings, the signs of that are likely to be more vivid northern lights or auroras, visible over a wider area than usual, and perhaps disruptions to radio and satellite communications. The person in charge of coordinating the government's response to these potential disruptions is Bill Murtaugh. He's program coordinator for NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center. So, Bill, help us understand this. Peak activity for the solar cycle. Help us break that down. Activity, what's going on? What's the activity?
So the sun it's like the Earth in one way. It's a big magnet. It's got a north pole and a south pole, a negative and a positive polarity. But the sun does something a little bit weird. Over the course of 11 years, it does a reversal of the polarity. The sun is a big ball of electrically charged gas turning and rotating. And as this rotation happens, the magnetic fields turn and twist. And essentially, it's a rotation of that magnetic field over that 11-year period. Right in the middle of that process, these sunspots emerge, and they're localized magnetic stressed areas on the sun that can produce these big eruptions. And when the eruptions occur, solar flares, coronal mass ejections, energetic particle events, they all blast material or energy and radiation towards the Earth and can affect a lot of the different technologies we rely on for everything we do. And it just happens that right now we're in the very middle of this 11-year reversal process, and we refer to it as solar maximum. So solar maximum being the period of most solar activity when we're seeing the most sunspots. So that's exactly what's been happening over the last couple of years and will happen for the next several years. Is in this period of maximum, we see lots of sunspots and lots of eruptions that will be affecting some of our technologies here on Earth, but of course producing that beautiful northern and southern lights as well.
Are some of these solar maximums more active than others?
Yes, it's kind of like the hurricane season. Like most of us know, some hurricane seasons very active, up to 20 hurricanes. Others not so much. You could have less than a handful of hurricanes. Same thing with the sunspot cycle. We've got some very big cycles. We've been measuring these sunspot cycles since 1755. The biggest one was actually solar cycle 19, which peaked in 1953. The last couple of cycles, including this current cycle, quite a bit smaller. So they do range in intensity, and indeed it's 11 years average, but sometimes we see them as quick as like a 9-year cycle. Sometimes it's all the way up to about 14-year cycle. So they do vary, again, kind of like hurricane seasons.
How do you measure what's going on? How do you track what's going on?
So back in the old days, people sometimes wonder how to do this back in 1755. Well, essentially, since Galileo and others invented the telescope, we've been watching the sun, projecting an image of the sun onto a white lightboard where you can see the sunspots. So we got this continuous record of sunspots dating all the way back to 1755. So that's a very useful database. That helps us establish that average 11-year cycle. But of course, technology has evolved tremendously over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So now we've got all sorts of instruments in space, taking pictures of the sun, monitoring the sun's surface, monitoring the corona, and then we've got the in situ, the in-place measurements, 1 million miles out in one spacecraft, and closer to Earth, we have more instruments measuring the emissions from the sun, all the way down to the surface of the Earth, where we have all sorts of instruments, again, measuring different types of emissions from the sun and how they're affecting the technology and the Earth's atmosphere, the Earth's ionosphere.
Tell us more about the practical effects of this on Earth and maybe even in space.
So these eruptions can occur. When they do occur, there's all sorts of emissions. And when the flare occurs, there's a blast of electromagnetic radiation. It can affect GPS, for example. It can affect satellite communications. Aircraft communicating with the ground can have interference. Very degraded communications can happen. We get these big energetic blasts of particles that will follow soon after the flare. They can affect satellites. They affect the astronauts in space, which is a big thing going forward, supporting the Artemis missions and going back to the moon. And the geomagnetic disturbance, that's really, really important. Because when the CME, that coronal mass ejection, hits Earth's magnetic field, it produces electrical currents, unwanted currents that can flow right into the power grid and cause big problems. And worst case scenario can actually produce a blackout. So it's one of the big things we have to do in the Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder is get the alerts and warnings out to the power grid owners and operators across the United States and Canada so they can take action to ensure we can keep those lights on during these big geomagnetic storms.
You talk about some of these past effects. I mean, I know that some of these records go back all the way to the 18th century. Tell us about that.
Well, it's just, again, I talked about hurricanes earlier. I'll do it again. People know what Hurricane Katrina and Sandy. In space weather, we've had our big events too. We had what's called the Carrington event in 1859, which was an extraordinary eruption. We had an astronomer in England watching the sun. He was doing his little spot drawing, and all of a sudden he sees these big white things on the sunspot drawing. He was looking at a major flare, and just 19 hours later, that coronal mass ejection made its way to Earth, impacted the Earth, and it surprised a lot of people because, our friends up in the north, in Canada, in Alaska, Scandinavia, they're used to seeing the northern lights. But what was it like in September of 1859 when the folks in Cuba and Central America looked up and could see the northern lights? So it's kind of a proxy measurement of how intense the magnetic storm was. It was a powerful storm, and even the technology of today, the telegraph systems, big long conductors, wires, lines, and the induced current went right through those wires, causing all sorts of havoc. So it was an extraordinary event, and it's the one that we fear today. If should it occur today, the consequence could be quite significant.
Bill Murtaugh of NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center. Thank you very much. It's fascinating.
John, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
And finally tonight, more from the cosmos. New research is revealing the secrets of Io, the mysterious volcanic moon of Jupiter. 4 centuries after Galileo discovered Io in 1610, NASA sent a first-of-its-kind solar-powered spacecraft called Juno on a 5-year, 1.7 billion-mile journey to Jupiter and its moons to see what it could discover with a color camera called JunoCam. Last week, NASA released animated artist conceptions of Io based on data Juno collected during 2 flybys. Juno's teams of scientists nicknamed this towering sharp peak feature Steeple Mountain. It's estimated to be as tall as 4.3 miles. By comparison, Mount Everest is just under 5.5 miles. This 127-mile-long lake is called Loki Patera. It's filled with cooling magma and rimmed by hot lava. There are islands in the center. The reflections JunoCam captured suggest that part of Io's surface is as smooth as glass, like the volcanic rock obsidian. Eruptions from Io's hundreds of volcanoes illustrate why some call it the tortured moon. It's relentlessly squeezed by Jupiter's tidal forces, creating tremendous heat, melting rock, and contributing to its status as the solar system's most volcanically active site. And that is PBS News Weekend for this Sunday. I'm John Yang. For all of my colleagues, thanks for joining us. Have a good week.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by Certified Connect.
On this Sunday night, reclaiming focus in schools, from cell phone rules to social media bans and vaping enforcement.
We need to be bold. We need to be comprehensive, and we need to act with urgency today.
Ontario's big plan to crack down on classroom distractions. Powerful father and son reunion. How a Calgary man finally got his family out of Gaza. An anti-war campus encampment spread to Canada. Ethnic violence reaches a breaking point in Sudan.
The worst case is Hiroshima and Nagasaki level casualties.
The UN's concerns of an imminent attack. And plunging into a mesmerizing world with open arms.
I just want to be the stepping stone of people to realize how incredible these octopus are.
Global National with Bara Nasser.
Good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with a major policy shift for schools in Canada's biggest province. Ontario is cracking down on cell phones in class and making changes to the rules when it comes to vaping. The province says its plan includes some of the toughest measures in this country to protect the mental and physical health of children and to curb distraction at school. But some advocates say that the plan itself is a distraction from more pressing issues. Kayla McLean reports.
Aiming for a slam dunk off the court, the education minister unveiling what he's calling some of the strongest measures in the country pertaining to restrictions on cell phone use and vaping in schools.
Every parent and teacher we speak to has shared the growing problem of cell phone distractions in class during instructional time, in addition to the disturbing rise of vaping in schools amongst our youth.
As of September, students in kindergarten to grade 6 will be required to keep their phones on silent and out of sight for the entire school day unless permitted by an educator. Students in grades 7 to 12 will see cell phone use banned during class time.
Unless explicitly directed by their educator, for a child is out of sight, out of mind when it comes to cell phones.
Quebec and British Columbia have already taken similar steps to ban the use of cell phones in class, but Lecce says Ontario will be the first to block access to all social media platforms on all public school networks and devices.
We're also going to be banning vape devices from schools and school-related settings, along with cannabis and nicotine and tobacco products.
Students who break the rules will be required to surrender their phones or vape devices, and their parents will be notified. Repeat offenders could face stiffer penalties like suspension. The government noting that $30 million will go towards installing vape detectors and other security upgrades in schools.
I see that this is something that students complain about a lot, especially inside the washrooms. It makes students uncomfortable to be in the washrooms, and it's also bad for students to do it.
Today's policy changes come after the PCs already implemented a cell phone ban in classrooms back in 2019. Lecce says there are differences.
The fundamental difference is this is the policy the province is implementing with standards, with consistency in the application, in the enforcement, and the educational component.
But some parents aren't buying it.
So on Friday, we learned that he cut more teachers from our schools by hiding the funding announcement, and today he shows up to distract us with a regurgitation of something we had 4 or 5 years ago, and it didn't work.
Kayla McLean, Global News, Toronto.
Diplomatic efforts are intensifying this week as pressure builds on Israel and Hamas to reach a ceasefire deal. This comes as Israel sets its sights on a ground offensive in Gaza. The U.S. Secretary of State is en route to the region for meetings starting tomorrow. But here in Canada, amid the anxiety and the horror, there is hope. Last night, a long-awaited reunion in Calgary. A son hugs his elderly parents who managed to flee Gaza.
It's very tough 7 months for us to know that, to wake up every day knowing that a cousin has been killed or injured.
He sponsored his family's escape from the war-torn enclave after surviving 7 months of fighting and constant Israeli attacks.
He's thankful. He felt so happy to see me and see his family here, and there's no safe space in Gaza.
While they're safe, look at what the civilians in Rafah are facing, running away from bombs, but also the rising temperatures. The UN says at least 2 children have died from the scorching heat. As the humanitarian crisis spirals, the risk of famine grows. Much-needed aid is ramping up, including from Israel.
In the coming days, the amount of aid going into Gaza will continue to scale up even more. Food, water, medical supplies.
Today, the World Central Kitchen confirmed it will resume operations beginning Monday, a month after 7 workers of the U.S.-based charity were killed in an Israeli airstrike. Without a plan for keeping civilians safe, Washington says it will not support a military operation in Rafah. But today, the White House revealed Israel has agreed to listen to its concerns before launching its assault.
That's going to be right at the top of the list for Secretary Blinken to keep pushing for this temporary ceasefire. We want it to last for about 6 weeks. He'll also be talking to the Israelis about their intentions and their thinking about Rafah military operations and sort of where they are in the planning stages for that.
The U.S. Secretary of State will meet Arab officials in Saudi Arabia on Monday to push for a political solution to the conflict. Hamas and Israeli officials will reportedly meet for truce talks in Cairo as well. But one thing is for certain, for civilians on both sides of this conflict, peace can't come soon enough. It has been a tense weekend at a number of American campuses flooded by anti-war protests. Some schools have closed their doors or shut down certain areas, and most of the protests have been peaceful, but activists are digging in their heels and telling authorities that they won't leave. The Associated Press is reporting that hundreds of students in the U.S. are being arrested, and in some rare cases, even expelled from their schools. And now the movement is spreading to Canada, with Montreal students also refusing to take down tents at McGill University, saying they'll stay until the school meets their divestment demands. Abigail Beeman reports.
Fresh clashes between pro-Palestinian protesters and groups supporting Jewish students at UCLA Sunday.
We have a big demonstration here planned with permits, and here we have a marauding band with pushing, shoving thugs.
We heard about the counter protesters showing up. They're trying to show up saying that this protest is full of hatred. So we're just here to counter them. We believe the state of Israel needs to be confronted.
We're going to open up Siemens Hall. Everyone, welcome.
And after this vandalism and ongoing occupation, Cal Poly Humboldt put up concrete vehicle barriers Sunday and is enforcing what it calls a hard closure, saying anyone on campus without permission could be arrested. Well, this was the scene outside a Missouri County jail Saturday night after 80 protesters were arrested for refusing to leave Washington University, including fringe presidential candidate Jill Stein.
Freedom of speech on a very critical issue that needs debate and dialogue.
Not just campuses, hundreds of protesters mobilized outside the White House Correspondents' Dinner, with a few getting inside the red carpet area, heckling attendees and removed by security.
The students in Montreal decided to heed the calls of their comrades in the United States and push forward this escalatory campaign.
Here in Canada, day 2 of a tent encampment on McGill's campus in Montreal. This woman claims to be a spokesperson but refused to give her name. She says the group won't leave until the school meets its demands, mainly divesting from any ties to Israel. McGill says the school and campus security asked them to remove the tents and they refused.
We decided to make ourselves unavoidable in order to leverage these demands.
We know that Jewish students feel unsafe.
Deidre Butler co-chairs an academics group for issues of anti-Semitism. She says freedom of expression and assembly have to be balanced with the right to student safety.
The problems on campuses predate October 7th and escalated in ways that none of us ever imagined since. The encampments are a further escalation.
A pro-Palestinian sit-in is planned at the University of Ottawa Monday, also calling for divestment. The school did not respond to a request for comment by deadline. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Quebec is investing $603 million over the next 5 years to protect the French language. The government laid out 9 priorities, including better monitoring language trends, boosting French cultural offerings, and improving students' mastery of the language. Several measures are linked to immigration. The province will focus on bringing in more economic immigrants who speak French and speed up permanent residency for international students who graduate from Francophone programs. Renting a home has long been perceived by many as a second-rate option to owning a home, the old adage being that you're not paying down your mortgage, you're paying someone else's. Trouble is, for many Canadians, home ownership is too much of a distant reality, a pipe dream, really. Especially when you consider that the average rent of a one-bedroom in Canada is close to $2,000 a month. In Toronto, it's $2,600, and in Vancouver, it's almost $3,000. And Gaviola reports on how some renters are adopting stricter financial discipline in the long road to own their own home.
17 years of renting, but home ownership still seems far away for Toronto resident Graham Isidore.
I have been able to put some money away, but that doesn't begin to approach what a down payment would be in the city.
A third of Canadian households rent, though many would like to own. 80% believe owning a home in Canada is now only for the rich, polling by Ipsos for Global News shows, a view most widely held among Gen Z and millennials. Though the housing market has calmed down since the red-hot days of the pandemic, prices remain high, along with borrowing costs. And despite skyrocketing rents in many markets, experts say financial security is possible for renters, but requires more discipline because homeownership is a forced savings vehicle.
In some circumstances, a renter, particularly if they're diligent with their saving, can come out ahead of a homeowner in the long run financially. It may not happen because people may not be as disciplined.
Real estate website Zoocasa analyzed 26 Canadian cities and found that renting is cheaper than paying a mortgage, especially in Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary. The lone exception was Winnipeg, where homeownership costs slightly less.
Homeowners are saddled with more maintenance costs too, and need a bigger emergency fund for repairs. A new roof or furnace isn't cheap, but how renters invest those savings is key.
If you're going to build wealth, my opinion is, yes, you have to have a bit more or a bit higher risk tolerance. I'm not saying you have to take high risk, but you need to be in that moderate or medium risk.
A path that may not seem as straightforward.
That means trying to navigate markets that I don't really understand as well, that are more complicated than just kind of putting money into your house each month.
Later in life, homeowners can sell their homes or downsize, giving them options that renters miss out on. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Political power play, how Alberta could soon have unprecedented powers. Coming up, why local politicians are pushing back against a controversial bill. Plus, how Vancouver Island's octopus whisperer is diving deep with these incredible animals.
Coke Studio, Season 15.
In Alberta could change how much control municipal officials have over their own governance. As Heather Yorks West reports, the changes would give the province the powers to repeal bylaws and even remove elected officials.
The Honorable Premier. It's stuff you learn in grade school social studies. Different levels of government take care of different tasks.
Now, fence, that's a federal government job. Healthcare and education is up to the provinces, and potholes and pet control, that's left to the cities and towns. Except
the province could make Edmonton and Calgary disappear if they wanted to through legislation.
That's because Canada's constitution divides jurisdiction between the provinces and the feds, but local governments aren't guaranteed power in the same way. Its authority comes from the provinces, and in Alberta, the province made it clear this week that they can take that power back.
Through this legislation, we are ensuring that locally elected officials and councils are accountable to the Albertans who elect them and make decisions that are clearly in Alberta's interest.
Bill 20 gives the provinces sweeping powers over municipalities, including the right to fire councillors or overturn bylaws. The mayors of Calgary and Edmonton were not pleased.
The province should not be coming in and threatening mayors and councillors, saying that if we don't think the way the province thinks, that they're going to fire us and remove us from office.
If the people that are in provincial government right now are interested in doing the work of the municipal government, perhaps they should have run for these positions.
The legislation is also the second time Alberta has moved to limit the power of municipal governments in less than a month. Bill 18 blocks local governments, along with any provincial entity, from making deals directly with the federal government. If passed, moving forward, they would need the province's consent.
Between 18 and 20, you are really telling municipalities, I'm sorry, your decisions don't matter. You can't advocate on behalf of your citizens. You can only do the work that we ask you to do.
My message to Ottawa is that federal politicians, and the Prime Minister in particular, should do his job and stop trying to do my job.
The Premier of Alberta asserting power over all that is constitutionally protected provincial jurisdiction, and all the additional responsibility that may come with that claim. Heather Urix West, Global News, Calgary.
Catastrophic crisis ahead, an urgent appeal to help Sudan by the UN. Five people in China have been killed by a powerful tornado. It struck the southern port city of Guangzhou, where at least 33 others were injured. State media says the twister damaged more than 140 factory buildings, but it didn't destroy any homes. Adding to the chaos, nearby farmlands and residential compounds were hit by hailstones the size of golf balls. And severe weather is continuing its path of destruction across the southern United States this weekend. Multiple tornadoes touching down in several counties in Oklahoma on Saturday night. The storm's being blamed for 4 deaths, including a child. There were over 100 tornadoes detected in 6 U.S. states on Friday alone. The states of Nebraska and Iowa were severely impacted as well. The United Nations Security Council is expressing deep concern for the crisis in Sudan's Darfur region. An opposition military group is closing in on the region's main city, and thousands are at risk if the conflict with the Sudanese army escalates. The numbers out of Sudan are mind-boggling. Nearly 7 million people are uprooted from their communities, the biggest internal displacement crisis in the world. Nearly 5 million children are under the age of 5, and new or expected mothers face malnutrition. Redmond Shannon now in a crisis that the world simply cannot ignore.
This is believed to be Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces heading toward the city of El Fasher in North Darfur. It is the last part of the vast region not under RSF control. Global News cannot independently verify the video, but experts say it is likely from the past week, and they dread what it could mean.
The worst case is Hiroshima and Nagasaki level casualties.
Nathaniel Raymond says the RSF is now at the edges of El Fasher. The experienced human rights investigator has been monitoring alleged atrocities in Sudan's year-long war using high-definition satellite images.
Women were raped en masse in the cities that RSF have taken, and in some cases children were thrown into buildings on fire. We know what RSF will do. Anyone who says that RSF will not engage in mass atrocities here has not been paying attention.
The RSF denies allegations it has been involved in ethnic cleansing against non-Arabs in Darfur as it fights Sudan's armed forces. United Nations experts say 10 to 15,000 people were killed in the city of El Geneina when the RSF captured it last year.
The amount of people from groups that they have targeted for killing is 5 times larger than El Geneina here.
In 2020, international peacekeeping troops left the region after a 13-year mission established in Darfur following the killings and deaths of 200,000 people there 2 decades ago. The UN Security Council issued a statement of concern on Saturday about El Fasher.
It's so painful also to see the level of neglect by the international community towards Sudan question.
Sudanese activist Hala Al-Karib says hundreds of thousands of people have fled to El Fasher for safety during the conflict. And now, as the world is distracted by other wars, many of those people face the most horrific of fates. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Deep Sea Secrets next. The Canadian octopus whisperer featured in James Cameron's new National Geographic documentary. A new documentary series produced by James Cameron is taking a deep dive into a special resident of British Columbia, the giant Pacific octopus. As Global's Kylie Stanton reports, a Vancouver Island resident known as the Octopus Whisperer was tapped to make it happen.
It's like leaving one world and entering another. Now, 2 years and 1,500 hours of filming later, audiences are being welcomed in with open arms, or more accurately, 8 of them.
It was really exciting to see.
And Crystal Janicki has seen her fair share of exciting things.
I'd had so many, really amazing encounters, super special.
Which is why she was tapped to be part of the new National Geographic series, Secrets of the Octopus, paired up with a fellow local cinematographer, Maxwell Hahn, to capture the giant Pacific octopus.
I took him on one of our first exploratory dives, and they decided that, you know what, let's get the local to film because he knows this area a lot better than we do.
The duo spent hours underwater looking for just the right one, and the patience paid off.
We ended up finding one that really kind of took us under one of her tentacles and became pals with it, and she led us across a lot of the reef to show us where she hunts for crabs and things like that. It was really amazing.
Their work makes up the Canadian part of the series that documents octopuses from 5 countries, showcasing divers gaining their trust and forging a bond, while capturing never-before-seen behaviors.
It just felt like magic.
All of it backed by some major star power.
Because the executive producer is James Cameron, it's quite publicized, and we've got Paul Rudd narrating the series, so it's received a lot of attention, and so far it's been very positive, and everyone's really enjoyed it.
But Janicki isn't letting the screen time she's had go to her head.
I just want to be the stepping stone of people to realize how incredible these octopus are.
The hope is the series will help drive conservation efforts. Those involved say there's no doubt 8 tentacles will be pulling on everyone's heartstrings.
It's really, really cool to have people wanting to learn more.
Patty Stanton, Global News.
And that's Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Farah Nasser. On behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. Tonight's Your Canada is Ucluelet, British Columbia. Dinah will be back with you tomorrow. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.
Today, a national cabinet called with the federal government open to new ideas to address gender-based violence.
We need to look at the full suite of policy measures that can make a practical difference here.
Also ahead, the parents of the teenager accused of stabbing a Sydney bishop speak out, detailing their son's anger and mental health concerns. Renewed hope of a ceasefire deal can be reached between Israel and Hamas at negotiations in Egypt as international pressure grows over the war's devastation. And the ACCC finds scammers are taking money from Australians at record levels, and it's the elderly most likely to lose their savings. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Ross Childs. The Prime Minister has called an urgent meeting of the National Cabinet to find better ways to tackle gender-based violence. The meeting of the nation's leaders is in response to rallies at the weekend, which attracted tens of thousands of marchers in cities and towns across the nation. There's been a sharp rise in the number of women killed so far this year. Reporter Jessica Rendell has more.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has justified his reasons behind not declaring this a national emergency. He says that this isn't suitable for a scenario like this. He says that national emergency declarations trigger things like one-off payments and are mostly reserved for incidents like bushfires and floods, shorter-term incidents like that. He has acknowledged that this is a crisis and says that it's a longer-term issue and requires societal change and for things like respect to be taught to young boys and men. He spoke to News Breakfast a little earlier today about his government's plan. Take a listen.
We have to change culture. This isn't something that requires a one-off action. This is something that requires concerted action from all levels of government, from the media, from all levels of society to change culture because this is a scourge that hasn't just come in the last week or the last month or the last year or the last decade. This is something that's been around for a very long period of time.
Tens of thousands of people marched across the country this weekend, from Sydney to Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth, and even regional towns like Bendigo. And they all called for the same thing. They called for action, they called for change, and they called for an end to the violence against women. Some of the key speakers at these rallies called for specific things like changes to bail laws and for the legal system to be revisited and changed to better protect women. We know that in many cases recently, the offenders were either on bail at the time that they killed their partners or former partners. And so people are asking for the legal system to be changed in this space and for breaches to domestic violence orders to be made more serious, particularly with those consequences surrounding them. They also asked for changes to be made in the language that we use when talking about these scenarios. One particular speaker in Perth said that the language should be changed from either domestic or gender-based violence to male violence, as this brings men into the conversation and makes it an issue for men and not just women. They argue that calling it gender-based or domestic violence minimises the issue. So many different topics were discussed at rallies across the country. There were also calls for more funding to support services, many that say they are stretched, that they can't help the people that are coming to them because they simply don't have the money or the time or staffing and resources to do so, and that many women are falling through the cracks. At these rallies, they called for politicians to take action, and no doubt all eyes and ears are on our authorities in this country to do something about this issue.
The Prime Minister told the Canberra rally more action is needed, including from his government. Political reporter Nicole Hegarty has more from Parliament House.
We know that Anthony Albanese says more action is needed and that governments and society as a whole need to do more. He's labelled gender-based violence a national crisis, citing the fact that now 27 men have been charged with murdering women in the first 4 months of this year. He's pointed to a greater focus on prevention as well as the response, and he's also called a national cabinet meeting for Wednesday, where all the state and territory leaders, as well as himself, will discuss this issue and work towards a pathway forward.
And the Prime Minister, Nicole, has played down accusations that he lied to the organiser of a rally against gendered violence. How's he responded?
Yes, that's right. So the organiser of this rally, of the nationwide rallies, but who was at this one in Canberra yesterday, had accused the Prime Minister of lying when he said he was denied an invitation to speak at the event. She said, and this is Sarah Williams, she said that his office had made clear to her and other organisers that he only intended to march and not to speak. This was a large event and there were numerous exchanges and some heckling of the Prime Minister as well, criticising the government's response to gendered violence. The Prime Minister says he was happy to attend yesterday's event either as a marcher or to speak. Here's some of what he's had to say.
Quite clearly, we need to get together to see what we can do to improve the situation, because women in particular are very frustrated and they're angry, and that is understandable that that is the case.
Anthony Albanese has also congratulated the organiser Sarah Williams for her efforts in setting up these nationwide rallies. We're yet to see in 2 weeks' time what's included in the next federal budget as to whether there's more money specifically allocated to address what the Prime Minister himself has described as a national crisis.
Nicole, thank you. And if the story has raised any issues for you, you can get help by calling the National Sexual Assault and Family Violence Counselling Helpline on 1800 RESPECT, which is 1800 737 732. The parents of the 16-year-old charged over the stabbing of a Sydney bishop have spoken publicly for the first time, detailing their son's serious anger management issues and long-standing mental health concerns. Investigative reporter Sean Rubenstein-Dunlop has interviewed them for 7:30. He says the parents are fearful of retaliation.
Well, we spoke to the parents in a secret location. They're still in hiding in fear of reprisals after that stabbing triggered a riot 2 weeks ago. Now, as you can imagine, it was a really emotional interview. It'll be aired on the 7:30 program tonight. The parents sobbed as they expressed relief that the bishop survived the attack and thanked police for protecting their son. Now, this boy is charged with terrorism, an offence that could see him in jail for life. But they say he's no terrorist. They paint a picture of a life involving a history of serious violence, severe behavioural issues, and a suspected developmental disorder, autism spectrum disorder.
What he did is totally inexcusable. We're not looking for him to be exonerated. We just wanted to have a fair go, the same as any other young person in similar circumstances with undiagnosed mental illness.
So what else have you discovered about the boy's history, Sean?
Well, we found the boy had been interacting with extremists in Sydney and following extremist accounts online in the months leading up to the attack. He liked videos on social media of terrorists like Osama bin Laden promoting dying for the cause. He even had a profile picture on WhatsApp, which was a portrait of bin Laden smiling. Now, we also found that in the hour before the attack, around 6 p.m. that evening, the boy made a final post to Instagram urging Muslims to open their eyes to disbelievers, and I'm quoting here, attain victory over their enemies. We spoke to a de-radicalisation expert, Peter Lowe. Here's what she had to say about that.
It's very common for individuals to have what they call leakage just as they approach actually conducting an attack. So it was a very clear message that he had got to the point where he was motivated to act on his beliefs.
Sean, you've also been investigating the terror network that the boy was an alleged part of. What did you find there?
Well, last week, as you know, this attack triggered mass police raids across Sydney. Police raided 13 addresses and they arrested a group of boys who they allege are part of a terror network involving this 16-year-old boy. Police allege that these boys were in preparations for a terrorist attack, some of them, and a number have been charged with conspiring to prepare for a terrorist attack. Now, we've been investigating this police operation and found that last week police questioned an influential and notorious Islamic State member, and they're investigating whether he had an influence over these boys. He's a 56-year-old man named Wasim Fayyad. He has a history of serious violent crime and was alleged to be a member of an Islamic State cell while serving 7 years behind bars. He actually met with young terrorists who went on to commit acts of terrorism, including the 2015 fatal shooting of Curtis Cheng at the New South Wales Police Headquarters in 2015. Some of those young men were found to have been involved in the planning of that attack. Now, he was released from jail in late 2020 and put on an extended supervision order because of concerns around terrorism, but a judge refused to extend that last year. Now, he wasn't charged last week, but police are investigating whether or not he was involved in this alleged terror network.
And you can catch Sean's full interview tonight on ABC TV on 7:30 and then anytime on ABC iView. Well, Bishop Mari Emanuel has given his first sermon since being discharged from hospital after the stabbing. He thanked worshippers and those who sent him messages of support. The bishop, who was wearing an eye patch to cover his injuries, used the service to address the teenager accused of attacking him.
This young man who did this act almost 2 weeks ago, I say to you, my dear, you are my son. And you will always be my son. I will always pray for you. I'll always wish you nothing but the best.
There are hopes of a ceasefire deal can be reached between Israel and Hamas when talks resume in Egypt today. The Israeli government is under enormous pressure to agree to a deal to get the remaining hostages released and scrap plans for a ground invasion in Rafah. Meanwhile, student protests in the US over the war have intensified in the past week, with a number of encampments now in place at colleges including Columbia, Yale and New York University. Dozens of students have been arrested as demonstrators call for universities to divest money from arms suppliers. Global Affairs editor John Lyons has more.
They have been growing quite dramatically. Started at Columbia and a couple of the Ivy League universities, and they're now spreading out across the US. There's been as many as 550 arrests and violence on some campuses, clashes between some pro-Israeli and some pro-Palestinian demonstrators, some ugly scenes, and different universities are reacting in different ways with different levels of strength or force, if you like. And so we're starting to see ugly scenes there. As we are here, there were some ugly scenes at Sydney University here over the weekend where one of the pro-Palestinian demonstrators brought some children along, and the children were chanting various slogans, and I think most people would have a level of repulsion at children being used in any of these demonstrations, and it's creating divisions all around the world, really, as this conflict has since it began on October 7. For example, the Australian Jewish Association has said that, has called the demonstrations at the University of Sydney, called them Hitler Youth rallies, and has said that there will be a strong response from the Jewish community at the University of Sydney. Now, I know that rhetoric is high and emotions are high, but I think to be calling these sort of rallies Hitler Youth rallies, I really think is also from the pro-Israeli side using rhetoric that is dangerous.
And what do the students want their unis to do?
The students want a number of things: ceasefire in the war. They want divestment of money that some of these universities have funding from Israel or supporters of Israel. They want a divestment of that. Some of them, of course, are arguing as well for a Palestinian state. But it's essentially the ceasefire and the divestment that are the primary aims of some of these students.
So there are fresh ceasefire talks in Cairo now. What level of hope is there around those?
Well, right at the moment, Hamas has officials going to Cairo, where those talks will be held over the next day or two. We've had a lot of false dawns when it's come to ceasefires. At some point, something has to give and something has to hold. So the US is raising hopes and suggesting that there's a strong possibility that there could be at least a 6-week pause, is the amount of time that the US is talking about. And during that time, of course, there'd be a lot of humanitarian aid going there. Children are starving, people are starving right now in Gaza. Although the US and others have been dropping from the air because there simply hasn't been enough aid, Israel has not allowed anything like enough humanitarian aid in there now. We are seeing starvation. People kept talking about we're on the brink of famine and starvation. Starvation and famine are happening in Gaza now, and the US, as the president goes into an election, wants to try to end that.
John, thank you. And the World Central Kitchen will resume distributing food in Gaza this week, a month after 7 of its aid workers were killed in an Israeli airstrike. The organisation is one of the main suppliers of aid into Gaza, distributing more than 43 million meals in the territory since the war started. Israel has admitted grave mistakes led to the fatal strike and dismissed 2 senior officers over the incident. World Central Kitchen still wants an independent investigation into the deaths of the aid workers, including Australian Somi Franco. A 4-month-old baby is among 4 people who died after tornadoes swept through the US state of Oklahoma. The destructive outbreak of severe weather flattened buildings and destroyed infrastructure in towns across the state. Tens of thousands of people remain without power. There was extensive damage in the town of Sulphur, with the federal government offering its full support.
We will rise, we'll clean up, we'll rebuild, and we'll move forward. And we'll be here every step of the way with Sulphur and the other communities across the state.
Tesla CEO Elon Musk has made a surprise visit to China to discuss the rollout of self-driving technology. According to state media, during a meeting with Mr. Musk, Premier Li Qiang cited Tesla's operations in China as a successful example of economic cooperation. Early this month, Mr. Musk said on social media platform X that Tesla could make full self-driving available to Chinese customers very soon. His visit comes after US reports tied Tesla's auto plant convening this week.
Silver Jubilee.
This is Asia Now.
Good morning. It's 11 a.m. in Singapore and in Hong Kong, 8:30 in New Delhi, and 10 o'clock in Jakarta. I'm Teresa Tang. At this hour, heat waves are scorching large parts of Asia. In-person classes have been suspended in the Philippines, while Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh brace for temperatures soaring beyond 40 degrees Celsius. Fresh Israeli strikes on Rafah kill more than a dozen Palestinians. The attack comes just hours before ceasefire talks will start in Egypt with Hamas leaders. And telecom giant Singtel forecasts a net loss for the second half of the financial year, as it flags a more than $2 billion impairment charge relating to its Australian subsidiary Optus. Parts of Asia remain in the grip of extreme heat, with hot weather prompting governments to issue heat warnings. High temperatures have been reported in the region in recent weeks, forcing school closures amid concerns of heat-related illness. Such action is observed in the Philippines, where in-person classes are suspended for 2 days. More than 47,000 schools are affected. Thousands of students switched to remote learning after the mercury reached a sweltering 38.8 degrees Celsius. March, April, and May are typically the hottest and driest time of the year in this region, but conditions have been exacerbated by the El Nino weather phenomenon.
So dito po sa Pilipinas po sa atin, sobrang init po talaga yung as in nakakapaso na po talaga siya ng balat. Hindi po siya tulad ng karaniwan lang po dati na init na tolerable naman po. Ngayon as in hindi po talaga ako makatagal sa init.
Yung pagtuturo din, naapektuhan din kasi siyempre parang hindi ka komportable. Sa sobrang init, minsan basang-basa na yung likod namin, minsan talagang nahihilo din kami sa sobrang init.
Over in Thailand, soaring temperatures have led to a record surge in power usage over the weekend. Bangkok's heat index was listed as above 52 degrees Celsius and deemed very dangerous. Authorities have repeatedly issued health warnings amid rising heat-related deaths in the country. At least 30 people have died in the past 4 months, compared to 37 for the whole of last year. Myanmar forecasters have warned of mercury levels exceeding 40 degrees Celsius in the coming days. The country has been recording temperatures up to 4 degrees higher than the average in April. Cambodia and Vietnam are also expected to surpass 40 degrees Celsius. And it's a similar picture in India, where several states have recorded temperatures as high as 42 degrees Celsius. That's with voters queuing up in sweltering heat to vote in a general election. Authorities say that severe conditions are likely to continue over east and southern peninsular India for the next 5 days. Meanwhile, schools in Bangladesh have reopened, with millions of students returning despite the country's weather bureau warning of persisting extreme heat. Bangladesh is facing its longest heat wave in 75 years, with temperatures about 4 to 5 degrees higher than the 30-year average. Well, temperatures are so high, it's not just uncomfortable, but it's unhealthy. Heat exhaustion is a common risk that could affect anyone. It can include dizziness, headaches, shaking, and thirst. It's usually not serious, as long as the person cools down within 30 minutes. But heat stroke is its more serious version. And that's when the body's core temperature goes above 40.6 degrees Celsius, exhibiting symptoms like rapid breathing, confusion, or seizures. A heat stroke is a medical emergency that can cause long-term organ damage and death. Now, some people are more at risk to extreme heat, and this includes young babies, older people, those who must stay active, and those who are more exposed, such as homeless people. The heat could also exacerbate existing conditions, such as respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. A study in 2021 showed that just under 500,000 deaths a year are estimated to be due to excess heat. In Europe, as many as 61,000 people may have died during heat waves last summer. On the other end of the extreme weather spectrum, residents in China's Guangzhou are picking up the pieces after a powerful tornado tore through the city. Authorities said the tornado was of level 3 intensity, 2 tiers lower than the highest level of 5. At least 5 people lost their lives, while 33 others were injured. Rescue teams have descended upon the Guangdong provincial capital to assess the damage from the tornado. The storm brought severe rain on a region battling with damage from record-breaking floods. More rain is forecast for the province over the next 5 days, with a high risk of hail and tornadoes. Guangzhou authorities say the city's total rainfall for the month had reached 45 centimeters, the highest for April since 1951. Over in the United States, weather alerts sounded across the South, where dozens of twisters touched down. Flood watches and warnings are in effect for some states, including Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas. At least 5 people, including a child, were killed. Authorities are still assessing the extent of the damage. Tens of thousands of homes have been left without power.
We do still have a lot of nursing homes, hospitals that did, medical facilities that took hits last night, and so we're looking to make sure that they do have proper generator power and that these operations can still stand up.
Israel intensifies strikes on Gaza's southern city of Rafah, considered the last refuge in the enclave. Medical sources in Gaza say at least 13 people were killed. Hamas media outlets have put the death toll at 15. The attacks took place just hours before a Hamas delegation's arrival in Egypt to deliver its response to Israel's latest ceasefire proposal. It is uncertain if the latest strikes could derail efforts to broker a deal after months of failed negotiations. Reports say Egypt has also invited an Israeli delegation to participate in discussions. The terms of the current Israeli-backed proposal have not been published, but it's widely reported to provide for the release of 33 living hostages who meet a so-called humanitarian designation. That is, women, children, men aged over 50, and the sick. They will be exchanged for an undisclosed number of Palestinians held in Israeli jails. Hamas sources say the proposal also includes a second phase of a truce, in which Israel would reportedly allow free movement between South and North Gaza and a partial withdrawal of its troops. Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu have spoken on the phone amid mounting concerns of an Israeli invasion of Rafah. The White House says President Biden has reiterated his clear position on Rafah to the Israeli Prime Minister. The Biden administration has previously warned that it could not support an attack without an appropriate and credible humanitarian plan. CNA's Jaguti Dave tells us it is unclear if the latest call between the two leaders showed any sign of whether the U.S. could stop the attack on Rafah.
Biden's critics would argue that actually the position isn't really that clear. John Kirby, the White House's National Security Council coordinator, told ABC this week that President Biden was confident that the Israelis would address American concerns before launching an operation in Rafah. But, it didn't say that they would not launch that operation or would desist from such an operation. So it's really not clear what sort of leverage the United States has. On the other hand, John Kirby also on ABC this week expressed some sort of confidence that there would be more humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, especially through this temporary pier that the United States is helping to construct off the Gazan coast.
I will say that they have been increasing the amount of trucks that have been getting into Gaza. Now there's still challenges on the ground and getting it up into the north, but that's starting to happen, and the Israelis have started to meet the commitments that President Biden asked them to meet.
So there you have it, with some sort of confidence, as I say, expressed by John Kirby that there would be more aid getting into Gaza. And think about Mahmoud Abbas in Riyadh also saying that the United States effectively is the only one that can convince Israel not to launch an operation. However, with the Israeli foreign minister, his comments suggested that actually one of the things that is more likely to guarantee that Israel won't launch an operation is actually in the hands of Hamas, if they come up with a deal to secure the release of the remaining Israeli hostages that are in captivity since October the 7th. So it's not clear exactly how much influence the United States has, but Washington is expressing confidence that there at least will be more aid getting into Gaza, if not the end of a potential planned operation by Israel in Rafah.
International food charity World Central Kitchen says it will resume humanitarian work in Gaza later today. The nonprofit group stopped distributing food to the enclave nearly a month ago after 7 of its employees were killed in Israeli drone strikes. The incident had triggered widespread global condemnation. Israel's allies, including the U.S., had sought an explanation. Israel said its inquiries found serious errors and breaches of procedure by its military and dismissed 2 senior military officers. World Central Kitchen has distributed more than 40 million meals in the enclave. That's more than 60% of all international NGO aid. The charity says it now has more than 270 trucks filled with almost 8 million meals ready to enter through the Rafah crossing in southern Gaza. A recent UN report said more than 1 million people in the enclave are projected to face famine by July. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has issued a new plea for Patriot defense systems while calling on the European Union to start formal talks for his country to enter the bloc. The country's commander-in-chief has said the situation has worsened in the face of multiple Russian attacks. Ukrainian troops have had to fall back from 3 villages on the eastern front. Moscow is taking advantage of its superiority in manpower and artillery to make gains before a $61 billion aid package from the U.S. arrives in Ukraine. And Ukrainian commanders have conceded their situation will continue to deteriorate. The military has even begun to rely on volunteer fighters who are too old to officially join to bolster its ranks.
Alexander Taran's mobile artillery unit isn't officially part of Ukraine's military, but that hasn't stopped his men from destroying Russian targets. We get by thanks to the pension fund, says the 68-year-old commander, whose call sign is Grandpa. The all-volunteer unit called the Steppe Wolves is comprised of dozens of Ukrainian men, mostly over 60 years old, who are considered too old to be drafted, but still want to fight for their country. The unit also includes younger men who have been ruled unfit to fight. Roving behind enemy lines with truck-mounted rocket launchers, they take orders from field commanders and work with other troops despite lacking official support from the military. The unit is funded by donations and is stocked with faulty rounds they repair themselves, as well as weapons captured from the enemy. So far, efforts to officially integrate into the military have been unsuccessful, Taran said. During a recent visit by Reuters to their base in the southeastern Zaporizhia region, they were seen preparing rocket rounds later fired by troops from another unit.
Ті командири, які дають нам цілі, вони довольні, щоб ми спрацювали. Вони нам ще дають цілі, допомагають. БК, чим можуть, ми виїжджаємо, допомагаємо їм.
Ukraine's mobilization effort is struggling amid flagging enthusiasm more than 2 years into Russia's full-scale invasion. With Russian troops making progress in the east, analysts say Ukraine's shortage of manpower needs to be addressed. Earlier this month, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky approved new measures allowing the military to call up more troops and strengthen penalties for evasion. He also reduced the mobilization age from 27 to 25. Taran, who has been fighting since 2014, said coercion would be unlikely to be genuine enthusiasm from a potential recruit.
Your Asia Business Update is up next with Henry Yin. So what's going down at Singtel, Henry?
Yes, Teresa, Singtel flags big losses in the second half of this year. Its stock taking a dive after announcing a more than $2 billion impairment charge relating to its Australian subsidiary Optus. Plus,
we see ourselves as a disruptor in an industry that is ripe for disruption.
We speak to Hotel 101 Global. It's set to become the first Filipino company to list in the US as it bets on its pioneering hybrid condotel business model to propel global growth.
From here, possibilities are everywhere. From taking first steps here, to
beginning your own wealth journey here. From backing global trade ambitions here, to delivering on that promise here. That's why we're here, in the world's most dynamic markets. A bank.
South Africa marked Freedom Day on Saturday, the day on which 30 years ago, millions of South Africans braved long queues to vote in the first democratic elections, ending decades of white minority rule. The poll was won by the African National Congress, which has been in power ever since.
Our shackles had been cast off, the shackles that had tied us down for hundreds of years. The weight of centuries of oppression was no longer holding us down. Even though our backs bore scars of the cruel lashes of those who had whipped and subjected us for more than 300 years, on that day, as a united people, we stood tall as South Africans.
The main celebration took place in the administrative capital, Pretoria.
Today, 30 years later, we gather as a united people of all races at the same union buildings that once symbolized our pain and our oppression. As we celebrate today, we recall and honor all those who fought for justice, for peace, for freedom in our land.
But today there's discontent as South Africans face many challenges, including high unemployment and poor service delivery, with the ANC tipped to lose its majority in next month's general elections. The United Nations Security Council has sounded the alarm over reports of an imminent attack on the last remaining city in Sudan's North Darfur region that is not under the control of the Rapid Support Forces. Fighting over the past year between the paramilitary group and the country's military has seen tens of thousands of people die and more than 8 million people displaced across the nation. As the UN expressed its deep concern, calling on the warring parties to take steps to de-escalate the situation, local media in Sudan were reporting that a full-scale attack on the city of El Fasher was already underway. Humanitarian workers have said the world must act swiftly to prevent a potential genocide in the region, with hundreds of thousands of the internally displaced people having sought refuge in the city. As the RSF and its allies fought their way through Darfur region's other federal states, they were accused of a campaign of ethnically driven killings against non-Arab groups.
The 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld the 20-year prison sentence for singer R. Kelly on child sex convictions in Chicago. The decision announced on Friday affirmed the verdict reached by jurors in 2022 who found the Grammy Award-winning R&B singer guilty on 3 charges of producing child sexual abuse images and 3 charges of enticing minors for sex. Kelly's legal team expressed disappointment with the ruling and announced their intention to petition the U.S. Supreme Court for a review of the decision.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Woodman. Have a good life.